Well, hello. We're talking about Chapter 5 in CP 6610. And if you pull up your PowerPoint, you'll be able to see and follow along. And hopefully, this will help you as you move through this course. So, as we start about Chapter 5, we're first thinking about what are the attending patterns of clients. And so, their nonverbal behavior, their verbal behavior, and then we want to look at conflicts, incongruities, and discrepancies. And what we mean by that is what the client's face saying different than what their words are saying. So if they say, didn't bother me, what do we know? Well, it bothered them, right? Because their tone, their facial expression looks different than the words they're saying. So when we notice those discrepancies or there's incongruences, we want to point that out to the client. So I hear you saying that it didn't bother you. Seems to me that perhaps it did bother you. Or I hear you saying that it's not a problem. And when you say that, I see that your face looks very distressed. So we try to avoid using but, because but automatically negates the statement. So that's just a little bit about that first slide. So next slide. So there are 4 dimensions that we use for direct verbal observation of our client. One is the patterns of selective attention. And so what that means is what the counselor wants to talk about. So we want to be very careful because we talk about power in the counseling role. And so selective attention means that if I focus on a certain thing, if the client says, well, I came today because I'm having trouble in my marriage, I'm very depressed, and I'm having trouble with parenting. Selective attention would say, so what I hear you saying is you're having trouble with parenting, right? So I ignore the other 2, and that cues the client that I think that's the most important. So we want to try to avoid selective attention unless there's a diagnostic reason why we want to focus on one aspect. So we also want to think about the idea of client keywords. And so there are words that the client might say that tune me in to the issue at hand, or also that help me to get some rapport with the client by me repeating those words. So if the client says, I'm feeling just out of sync with the world around me, I feel helpless, I could just repeat helpless, right? What are those other key words that I hear the client using over and over and over again? So if I look at that pattern, that's going to help me to guide my session in a way that's most helpful for the client. I also want to look at I statements versus other statements. If you hear someone saying I a lot, then that tells you the focus is on them. If you hear someone using a lot of other statements, well, she made me do X, Y, Z, then it gives us that idea that they're not accepting responsibility for their own behavior. And so when we hear that she made me, that she forced me, well, I had to because of XYZ person, then we want to ask them to reframe that statement as an I statement. So I would say, I'd like you to say that again and start with, I felt blank when you blank. And so then I own my own behavior. We also think about the idea of abstract versus concrete conversations. And so when you think about that, you might want to look at Cynthia Tobias's work. You can Google her. She has a lot of really good information about abstract versus concrete learners. And so the idea of abstract is that it's all about theories, right? It's all about ideas. A concrete person is going to be the practical how-to. So if we have an abstract client, they're going to be talking a lot about ideas and theories. If we have a concrete client, they're going to really be pushing, but what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And so we really want to work at that. With every client, we always want to end our session with giving them something to do. Just like your medical doctor, when you go there, you want a prescription or you want an action plan. The same with our clients. They need something to do, which could be a very small something like keep a journal. Between now and our next session, I'd like you to notice this behavior in yourself. Or it could be bigger. So between now and our next session, I would like you to practice using I statements with your spouse. I'd like you and your spouse to go on a date, or for some clients that's even too big, so I'd like you and your spouse to have one 5-minute conversation between now and our next session that's not about your children and that's not about your work, that's about the relationship. So those are just some few things about that, observing verbal behavior. Next slide. So we want to look at what's some conflict internal to the client. So again, discrepancies in nonverbal versus verbal statements. It doesn't bother me, right, when it's obvious that it does bother them. I'm feeling distressed, and they look happy, right? And so those things are not congruent, so we want to point that out. So you're saying that you're feeling distressed, and your face looks happy. Tell me more about that. Choking, hesitation, or stammer. So if the client chokes on a word, or they hesitate, or they stammer, that's a red flag for me that maybe this is an issue for them. So I want to just notice that. I notice when you bring up your brother's name that you stammer, or that it's hard for you to say that. Tell me more about that, right? So we're just exploring, how does that relate? What they say and what they do. So if they say, I'm really good at managing my money, I have no problem with budget, and I get to about the middle of the month and I have no money left, right? So then I could say, on the one hand, I hear you say you're good at managing money. On the other hand, I hear you say you get through about half the month with no money left. So which is it, right? Statements and nonverbal behavior. So they make a statement like we talked about before, but their nonverbal behavior is incongruent with that statement. Next slide. So in summary, observation skills, we want to observe verbal and nonverbal behaviors to identify discrepancies, mixed messages, incongruencies. A discrepancy is often a problem for the client, but when we have a discrepancy, we learn a lot about ourselves. And so it's not necessarily a negative thing, but it's a way for the client to observe and to learn their own behavior. Everybody has discrepancies in their life, right? Nobody's 100% consistent. So we want to point that out to the client and then help them move towards their goals. Next slide. And you may want to look at the activity on page 142, exercise 1, for yourself to help you kind of go through this in your own way. Next slide. So again, we talk about concrete versus abstract behavior, and there's a YouTube video you can watch. Next slide. And that's the end. So I hope this has been helpful for you with chapter 5. Look forward to seeing chapter 6 soon.